Now, we've talked about Russia before, but we've talked about Russia in the context of it being the Kievan Rus, okay, up in Kiev and Moscow and Novgorod. Now, remember, the Kievan Rus was north to the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Remember, Rome was the capital of the Western Roman Empire. Constantinople was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, and they had beef. It used to be one Roman Empire, but then they broke into two. That break was in 1054, and it was over religion, the Great Schism. The West remained Catholic with the Pope and icons. The East became Eastern Orthodox with no Pope, no icons. Instead, they had a patriarch. Okay, so that Great Schism occurred, which means that the Byzantine Empire had enemies to the west of them, and they had enemies to the east of them. They had enemies with the Catholics, and they also had enemies with the Muslims in the east. So they wanted the people north of them to be their friends. They wanted allies. And so they tried to make the Kievan Rus an ally of the Byzantine Empire. In order to accomplish this, they linked themselves with the Kievan Rus politically, economically, and through marriage and religion. Okay, so economically, politically, and religiously. How did they do this politically? They had the leader of the Kievan Rus marry the daughter of a Byzantine emperor. How did they do this religiously? They sent missionaries. Y'all may remember Cyril, the missionary who created the Cyrillic alphabet, which later became the Russian alphabet. And they established trade with the Kievan Rus. Okay, so the Byzantine Empire and the Kievan Rus were tight. The Kievan Rus are going to form the Russian Orthodox Church. Remember that they become Christian because of missionaries like Cyril, and Cyril is going to be spreading the Byzantines' Eastern Orthodox religion. Eventually, that's going to become a Russian version of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, Rome fell in 476. So Constantinople claimed that it was the new capital of the Roman Empire, but then Constantinople fell in 1453. This means that the Kievan Rus are the last ones standing. And so the Kievan Rus, or Russia, is going to claim that Roman heritage. They say that now Moscow, after 62, is going to be the new capital of the ancient Roman Empire. So they're continuing that heritage. First Rome, then Constantinople, then Moscow. So not only do they take their religion from the Byzantine, they also take their claim of being a part of the Roman Empire, the inheritors of the Roman Empire and Roman culture. And so in this vein, the leaders of Russia, after they overthrow the Mongols in 1462, are going to call themselves Caesars, or Tsar for short. Now, if you see Tsar spelled with a Z, that's fine. It's just a different spelling for the same word. But these czars are going to rule with the support of the church because they claim the divine right of kings. Now, we know that when a ruler claims divine right, they typically tend to rule in an absolute manner. So Russia is going to become an absolute monarchy where the czar holds 100% of the power and is constantly fighting with the nobles for that power. Does that make sense so far? So all of this is context. What happened before Russia overthrew the Mongols? Well, Constantinople fell, therefore there's no Byzantine Empire. There's no more trading partner for the Kievan Rus. So they form their own empire, claiming to be descendants of ancient Rome. And they have a lot of similarities with the Byzantine Empire due to being tied politically, economically, and religiously to the Byzantine Empire. So we're seeing a lot of European influences in Russia at this time, but Russia is smack dab in the middle of those two continents. It's a part of Eurasia, so it's in Europe and it's in Asia at the same time. So what are some influences from Asia? Well, the Mongols come and invade in the 13th century and take over the Kievan Rus, establishing a tributary state under the Golden Horde. Y'all may remember Batu Khan. So the Mongols establish a tributary state where the Russians have to pay them tribute. Because of tight Mongol control, Russia is not going to experience a renaissance like the rest of Europe. Whereas the rest of Europe is going through a rebirth and entering into the age of exploration and getting all this new technology and new ideas, Russia was still under the control of the Mongols. Okay, so they're going to be behind their European counterparts. Also, the spread of gunpowder under the Mongols is going to make Russia a gunpowder empire. Okay, so those are some Asian influences there. What about European influences? Well, obviously the Byzantine Empire is going to be a huge factor in the cultural aspects of Russia. Also, most of Russia's capitals are going to be in Europe. Kiev and Moscow, St. Petersburg, eventually, when Peter the Great takes over. All of their capitals are going to be in Europe, not in. So that's a European influence. All of these capitals being in Europe means that Russia is going to come into contact with the Enlightenment. They missed the Renaissance, but they're back in time for the Enlightenment ideals to spread. Okay, so you have Asian influence from the Mongols and European influence, notably from their Viking descendants from Scandinavia, first starting the Kievan Rus before the Mongols came in and established a tributary state. So what's the physical boundary between Europe and Asia? How do we know where Europe begins and where Asia ends? Well, the Ural Mountains, which is one of your vocabulary words, is the geographic physical boundary between Europe and Asia. You'll note that Russia begins over here on the western half of the Ural Mountains, but eventually is going to spread past that boundary to control both parts of Europe and Asia. So geographically, the barrier is here, but Russia is going to supersede those boundaries. Now, being in the middle of Asia and Europe does have its benefits. What's a benefit that Russia can get from their geographic location in Eurasia? What's a positive that they get from being smack dab in the middle? Trade in both Europe and Asia. Good, especially through what land route? Good, the Silk Road. Remember that during the Pax Mongolica, trade on the Silk Road was popping. Okay, so they've revived the Silk Roads. Once the Mongols lose control, the Silk Road trade isn't going to be as great because everyone moves to maritime routes instead with the age of exploration. But still, Russia is going to benefit from its geographic location in terms of trade. They're in an excellent spot for trade, especially with access to the Silk Road. One of their main exports is going to be the fur trade, which makes sense. Russia is super cold. So they're going to be exporting fur to Europe and to China. But they're also going to export a lot of other raw materials like grain, leather, iron, hemp, wood, pitch, tar, caviar, which is fancy people eggs, and honey. With the exception of leather and iron, all of these goods that they export, and export means to sell, all of these goods that they export are raw materials, okay? Wood and pitch and tar, those are going to be used to make ships because pitch and tar makes the ships waterproof. Okay, caviar is just fish eggs. Honey you get from honeycomb. Grain you get from the fields. Obviously, leather you have to treat from animal hides, and iron you have to melt down iron ore to make it. But for the most part, you don't see a lot of industrialization in Russia. Instead, you see exporting of raw goods. And that's because Russia is naturally resource rich. They have a lot of natural resources that they can sell for their benefit, kind of like the New World. Except, did the New World colonies get to benefit from the selling of their raw materials? No, they did not. Remember, under mercantilism in the New World, all of the New World's wealth went back to the mother country to benefit the mother country. But Russia isn't a colony. Okay, they're no longer a tributary state once they overthrow the Mongols. And so they are going to be able to sell their own resources for their own benefit. Are we good so far? All righty. So how do we go from the Kievan Rus to Russia? Okay, so they went from the city of Moscow and the territory of Moscow to an entire empire. Well, we know that they're on the fringe of Europe, somewhere between Europe and Asia. And so they have influence from both sides. They have their influence of Viking descent from Scandinavia. The Vikings were a very militaristic seafaring people that led raids on towns and squares. So that's going to play into the militaristic personality of Russia. Also, the Mongols were very militaristic. And it's because of the Mongol influence in particular that the Russians are going to become a gunpowder empire. Now, we've talked about other gunpowder empires, most notably the Muslim gunpowder empires, the Mughal dynasty in India, the Safavid in Iraq and Iran, and the Ottoman in the former Byzantine Empire. Okay, those are the Muslim gunpowder empires because they're Muslim. Russia is a Christian gunpowder empire, a land-based empire that uses gunpowder technology in order to rise up and expand. Okay. Also from Europe, they have influence from the Byzantine Church, where they adapt Eastern Orthodoxy into Russian Orthodoxy. But the Mongols come in and take over in the 1200s, and they're going to rule there until 1462. Because of that control, Russia fails to go through a renaissance. They have to wait until they overthrow the Mongols in order to form their own empire. Once they do succeed in overthrowing the Mongols, we're going to see rapid expansion of Russia. Russia is going to become larger and larger under the czars. They're also going to use mercenary soldiers. Okay, a mercenary is a soldier who works for pay, and they're going to pull from the Cossacks. The Cossacks are basically Russian cowboys. These are serfs and peasants who escaped and are living in the wilderness, living off the land. And occasionally they'll fight for the government if the government pays them. Other times they try to overthrow the government because they don't like it so much. Okay, so it's kind of like a very tense relationship there. So if you look at the Mongol control under Genghis Khan, okay, remember that Genghis Khan formed the largest continuous land empire in history, starting in Karakoram. When he dies, his heirs, like Kublai Khan and Batu Khan, are going to expand his empire. Kublai Khan expands into China and establishes the Tang dynasty, or sorry, the Yuan dynasty, okay? The Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan. Then the Golden Horde under Batu moves into Russia, conquers Kiev, Moscow, Novgorod. and they're going to establish tributary states. Now, why did the Russians and all of them pay tribute to the Mongols? Because the Mongols could beat them up. If you didn't pay the tribute to the Mongols, then they would kill you to death until you died. Now, that's a big threat when the Mongols are strong and in charge, but when they start to weaken after Genghis Khan's and his successors' deaths, y'all remember that the Mongols were very good conquerors, but they weren't great administrators. And so one of the Russian princes in Moscow is going to notice that, hey, the Mongols aren't as big and bad as they used to be. I think we can call their bluff. Next time they show up to collect their tribute, I'm going to send them packing. And so that's exactly what he did. Ivan III becomes the first Tsar of Russia, okay, who refused to pay tribute to the Mongols, to the Golden Horde. He calls their bluff. So here in this painting, he's depicted as telling them, I'm not going to pay your tribute. And then he kicks them out of his palace. Now, once he overthrows the Mongols in 1462, he's set up very nicely to become the king of Russia. But he has to legitimize his rule. He has to have religious legitimacy and political legitimacy. Well, he gets both of those when he marries the niece of the last surviving Byzantine emperor. Now, y'all may remember, by 1462, there is no Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire fell in 1453 when the Ottoman Turks took over Constantinople. But the emperor survived. He didn't rule anything, but he still has, some respect for his position. So by marrying Zoe, the niece of the last Byzantine Empire, okay, Ivan III builds up some political clout. In terms of religious clout, well, the Russians and the Byzantine Empire were both Christian, the same type of Christian. So he legitimizes his claim to rule religiously and politically through his marriage to the niece of the last Byzantine Empire. And this makes him the Tsar, the Caesar of Russia. Remember, there's no more Byzantine Empire. There's no more ancient Roman Empire. So Russia claims that they are the last descendants of of Roman heritage. Hence, Tsar Caesar as their king. Does that make sense so far? Now, Ivan III was known as Ivan the Great. So what did he do that was so great? Well, he's going to triple the size of Russia. He expands Russia past Muscovy to be much larger. He rebuilds the palace in Moscow, the Kremlin. But not everybody is going to be his biggest fan. This ties back to the constant continuity throughout this time period, the constant power struggle between the nobles and the king, or in this case, the boyars and the czar. Boyar is one of your vocabulary terms. A boyar is a noble in Russia. That's all it means. And we know that there's a constant power struggle between the nobles and the king because they both want more power, so they try to take it from each other. So the boyars oppose Ivan III expanding Russia and getting all this power. So how does he respond? He takes their power. He takes their land, which remember is a form of wealth, and he forces them to live in the capital with him, just like Louis XIV of France did with his nobles at Versailles. He's going to force them to live in Moscow so he can keep an eye on his nobles. Now, the boyars and the czar aren't the only members of the Russian social hierarchy. This is a very static social hierarchy. Static meaning there's not a lot of changes. If you're born a peasant, you're going to die a peasant. If you're born a noble, you're going to die a noble. You're not going to go from being serf to merchant to czar. It's not going to happen. It's kind of like the caste system in India. There's not a lot of movement one way or another. So at the top of this hierarchy, you have the czar, the ruler, absolute control. Then you have the nobles, the people with land and money and influence who are vying for power with the czar. Then you have the middle class, the merchants, the artisans, lawyers, all of that. Then you have the farmers, the free farmers who own their own land. Okay, they're not rich, but they don't serve anybody else. And then finally at the bottom, you have the serfs. Okay, serfs are different from free peasants. Okay, because serfs are under a feudal obligation. Y'all remember that feudalism used to be a mutually beneficial contract. The noble lets you live on his land in exchange for you working his land. So he gets crops, you get a place to live in protection. But eventually that power dynamic is going to change to benefit the noble class over the peasant class. Okay, so serfs become owned labor. You can't sell and buy serfs, but they're tied to the plot of land that they've agreed to work on for that noble lord. And if someone else buys that land, then they have to work for whoever bought the land. So they're bound to the land and they have little personal freedom. They can't just go travel into town. They can't marry who they want. They have to get permission from the noble lord. Now, under the absolute rule of the czars, serfdom is going to get worse because the czar doesn't care about the serfs. They're not a threat to him. Yeah, they make up a majority of the population, but they don't have a lot of political influence or power. The nobles do. And the nobles like serfdom. So they're going to want to keep it. If the czar tries to get rid of serfdom, then the nobles will kill the czar. So in that power struggle, okay, the czars are not going to be that great to the serfs because the serfs don't give them anything that they need. Okay, so they're going to keep them in serfdom until after the Crimean War in the 1860s. Are we good so far? Here is Ivan the Great's wife, Zoe. Remember that they didn't get married for looks or for love. It was a political contract. So he married her because of what it could mean for him politically as the Tsar. His son, Vasily III, we don't really learn about in AP World History. So we're going to skip him and go to Vasily's son, who is Ivan III's grandson, Ivan IV. Now it's important that you keep track of which Ivan you're talking about. Hence the Roman numerals. Ivan III is Ivan the Great. Ivan IV is Ivan the Terrible, which is a misinterpretation of the Russian. He's supposed to be Ivan the Terrifying, which he is, but also he did some terrible things, so it kind of sort of fits. Now, Ivan the Terrible is going to come to the throne when he's a toddler. His father, Vasily, dies when he's 3 years old. Obviously, he can't rule Russia as a 3-year-old. He's still wearing Pampers, right? So the boyars come in and try to wrest power from the Tsar, okay? And so there's the constant power conflict between the people who support the Tsar and the nobles. Well, eventually, Ivan IV gets old enough to crown himself as Tsar. So when he's 16, he crowns himself with absolute power, and he uses his secret police, the Oprichnina, to enforce that power, to search out for spies and to kill his enemies. Okay, the Oprichnina secret police, kind of the precursor to the Russian KGB. Now, what is he going to do as ruler? Well, like his grandfather, he is going to make Russia bigger. So he extends eastward, but also westward. Eastward, he's going to move into Mongol land controlled by the Golden Horde. Western, he is going to try to get to the Baltic Sea for a warm water port, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And for this expansion, he needs a lot of gunpowder. Okay, this is a gunpowder empire, an empire that expands through gunpowder technology, just like the Muslim gunpowder empires. Now, as a result of this conquest, we see cultural diffusion. We know that cultural diffusion happens through conquest and trade. So the Russian religion of Christianity is going to spread due to this conquest. And it's also going to spread the fur trade throughout the East. In fact, they make it so far east that by 1741, the Russians reached the New World through Alaska. Remember that up in Canada, there was a lot of fur trade going on with the French taking advantage of that fur trade. So Russia is going to try and get involved in the New World as well. Are we good so far? So here we have Ivan the Terrifying, Ivan IV. Here he is depicted in traditional Russian dress. It's very cold, so it makes sense that they would wear long coats with lots of fur and a hat and gloves and boots. When the Romanov dynasty takes over after the time of troubles, Peter the First, okay, Peter the Great, is going to try to westernize Russia. Remember, Russia didn't have a Renaissance because they were under Mongol control at the time. So Russia is behind culturally. Peter the Great is going to try to modernize Russia, westernize Russia, and make it more like Europe. So Peter the Great is going to say, no more long coats. In Europe, where it's warmer, they wear their coats to their knees. So he'll even cut people's coats to their knees. He's going to say no more beards, because in Europe, they don't wear beards. They have nice little mustaches. And Peter the Great gets so mad whenever someone comes in front of him with a beard that he's known for ripping it out with his bare hands. Okay, so Ivan IV, very traditional conservative Russian culture. By the time Peter the Great comes along, that's going to change significantly as he tries to copy what Europe is doing. Okay, so later dynasty, Peter is going to come to power. So what did Ivan do that was good? Well, during his good period, he was married to Anastasia Romanov. This is not the same Anastasia from the Disney movie. Okay, that Anastasia lived around World War I, lived and died around World War I, because she was actually killed with her family, unlike what it says in the movie. So this is a different Anastasia. Okay, World War I was in the 1900s. We're 400 years away from that. Okay, Anastasia just happens to be a common Russian name. So like his grandfather, Ivan the Terrible is going to extend the empire, make it bigger, and he's going to build infrastructure to legitimize his rule. He builds schools, churches, and hospitals. Okay, so in that expansion, here's where Russia started. Muscovy, with the capital in Moscow. That's under Ivan III. Then you're going to see that expansion under this lighter blue area as we move from Ivan III through Vasily. And then here in green is where we see Ivan IV's territory added on. Okay, so Russia is going to very rapidly expand east. But Ivan IV is also going to move them west, with the main goal being acquiring a warm water port. And y'all, this is going to be a big continuity in Russian history. If there's ever a question for why did Russia do that? Why did they go to war? Why did they do this, that, the other? It's probably because they want a warm water port. Okay, that's probably going to be the biggest reason behind any war or any battle that they fight. Because remember, they have access to a lot of land-based trade, like the Silk Road, but during period 2, land-based trade wasn't popping. It was maritime trade. That's where everybody was trying to get in on. So Russia wants in on the maritime trade. Well, they're pretty much landlocked. And Russia is very cold. So the ports they did have in like northern Russia in Siberia, for about half the year, those ports were frozen over. No boats coming in, no boats going out, because it's a block of ice. And so they wanted access to a warm water port, like in the Baltic Sea, because this would enable them to do maritime trade for the whole year, rather than half the year, because their ports would freeze over, but their warm water port in the Baltic Sea wouldn't. Okay, so that's going to be a major continuity that you need to remember for Russia. Almost everything they do is because they want that warm water port. So if you had a good period, what's the bad period? Why is he called Ivan the Terrible? Well, y'all remember the secret police that he used to help maintain rule? He's going to go a little crazy with the Oprichnina, okay? It's not entirely his fault. I mean, his wife gets poisoned in an assassination attempt, and that makes him really paranoid. And so he sends out his Oprichnina and he's like, find out who's trying to kill me. Use torture if you have to. Well, the problem with using torture is that if you torture someone enough, they're going to tell you whatever they think you want to hear. You might be like, tell us who else is involved in the plan. And they'll start naming people that they knew from like elementary school, just because like you're pulling out their toenails. And so they get a lot of information that may not have been true, but the Oprichnina still hunt these people down. And so thousands of people are going to be killed due to Ivan IV's paranoia over assassination attempts. And it's not just people he perceives as enemies that are killed, it's his own family. He accidentally kills his own son in 1581 in a fit of rage. Now, how this happened was his son was married and his wife was pregnant with Ivan the Terrible's grandchild. Well, his daughter-in-law, who's pregnant, shows up to a dance and she's wearing a dress that he doesn't like. He thinks it's showing off too much. It's not modest enough. So he beats her. In the process of that beating, she loses the baby. So obviously his son is super, super ticked off. So his son goes to confront his dad for beating his pregnant wife. And Ivan IV doesn't really like that his son's talking back to him, so he beats him too, accidentally killing him. Okay, so here it is depicted in art. You see the struggle in the painting with the chair knocked over and the rug messed up and his walking cane that he hit him with over the head. And then you can see the horror and remorse in Ivan IV's face as he realizes what he's done, killing his only son, his only heir to the throne. So that makes a really big political problem. If there's no heir, who's supposed to rule when Ivan IV dies? And that question doesn't get answered for a decade after Ivan IV dies. Instead, they go into a period of anarchy known as the Time of Troubles, before they get together in a group and they're like, okay, we need a leader. Let's vote on somebody, anybody, because the Time of Troubles, this ain't it. Now, one of the good things that he did during his bad period was he built St. Basil's Cathedral. Okay, this was a way to legitimize his power, tying his power to religion. You build a fancy church, that shows that you and the church are united. That supports the theory of divine right. I'm in charge because God wants me in charge, and God wants me to be an absolute ruler. So here is St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. Now, we do see some cultural syncretism in this architecture. Okay, remember, syncretism is different from diffusion. Syncretism is the creation of something new, like Arabic mixing with the Bantu language in Africa to create Swahili along the eastern coast. That's syncretism. Arabic being spoken in Africa isn't syncretism. That's cultural diffusion. It means Arabic traveled from the Arabian Peninsula into Africa. But when it blends with something else to create something new, that's syncretism. And so here we see the combination of Roman heritage and Eastern heritage, particularly from India and the Islamic religion. What from this cathedral comes from Rome? What architectural feature? The dome, exactly. The dome comes from Rome. Okay, and you also see arches that come from Rome as well. Now, what's interesting about these domes is that they reflect the more Eastern version of domes. Okay, they look more like Hershey's Kisses, right? Another influence we get from the East is the colors used in painting this church and the geometric patterns. You see triangles and half circles, okay, and squares throughout this infrastructure. So you combine aspects of the Roman heritage, domes and arches, with aspects of Russia's Eastern heritage, influence from India, and geometric patterns from Islam, because remember, Islam was iconoclastic, so they focused on geometric patterns instead of paintings or pictures of deities or religious figures. And so we see the creation of something new. This is Eurasia. It's not purely Europe or purely Asia. It's a combination of the two, which is what Russia is. Are we good so far? Okay, what caused the time of troubles in Russia? They didn't have a strong leader. Well, wait a minute. They had the Rurik dynasty, where they had gotten Ivan the Great and Ivan the Terrible, who are Ivan the Third and Ivan the Fourth. What happened to the Rurik dynasty? How did it end? I'll give you a hint. Y'all remember going over this painting?
Yes.
Okay, so what's depicted in this painting? Good. Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Fourth, killed his only heir in a fit of rage, meaning no heir to rule over Russia once Ivan the Fourth died. Okay, so that means the Rurik dynasty is done for. It is dead. And so you have a state of anarchy and chaos that results from that. This supports Thomas Hobbes' argument about absolute government. Remember, Thomas Hobbes said that in a natural state, we enter into a period of chaos and anarchy. The only way to end it is to have a strong leader. Hence why absolute rule is the best rule, according to Thomas Hobbes. So this would actually support his thesis that an absolute ruler is necessary, because once they didn't have a strong absolute ruler, they enter into the time of troubles. And it lasts for 10 years until the Zemsky Sobor, which is a collection of Russian nobles, met to declare a new czar. They decided upon Michael Romanov. And so the Rurik dynasty is replaced by the Romanov dynasty. And this dynasty is going to be the longest lasting dynasty in Europe. This one family rules Russia for over 300 years, from 1613 until World War I, when the last of the Romanov family are assassinated and the Soviet Union begins in Russia. So up until the modern age, the Romanov dynasty is going to be in charge of Russia. And they're going to rule as absolute monarchs. They have full autocratic control, okay, meaning that they decrease the power of the nobles in order to increase the power of the Tsar. Like the Rurik leaders, Ivan III and Ivan IV, the leaders of the Romanov dynasty are going to continue to make Russia bigger. They're going to take more and more territory, often in search of their warm water ports so that they can engage in maritime trade. Also, most notably, Westernization occurs under the Romanov dynasty. Westernization is another word for modernization. This is going to lead to a series of changes in Russia. So change over time, one of our historical thinking skills. One of the main leaders of the Westernization movement in Russia is Peter the Great of the Romanov dynasty. He is going to cement Russia as a Western country, a European country, an empire, rather than as an Asian country, an empire.